50 Harleys shaking the asphalt. A wave of leather, chrome, and bad intentions rolling into a diner at the edge of nowhere. You'd think the woman behind the counter would freeze. Beg. Run. But she didn't. She just kept wiping the Formica, wrapped in an oversized, ratty denim jacket. They surrounded her, ready to tear the place down to the studs. Then, the lead biker grabbed her shoulder, saw the faded, blood-stained patch stitched over her heart, and stopped breathing. The heater in the Copperhead diner hadn't worked since the Obama administration. It sat in the corner of the room, a rusted metal box that occasionally spat out a metallic rattle just to remind everyone it was broken. Outside, the high desert of Nevada was putting on its usual November performance, bleak, biting, and relentlessly grey. The wind howled across the two-lane blacktop of State Route 375, throwing handfuls of sand against the diner's large plate-glass windows. Maggie stood behind the counter, a damp rag in her right hand, dragging it across the cracked linoleum surface in slow, methodical circles. She was 48, but the desert adds 10 years to a face if you let it, and Maggie had stopped fighting it a long time ago. She had ash-blonde hair tied back in a messy knot, eyes the color of old dimes, and a posture that suggested she was used to carrying things heavier than diner trays. To beat the deep, settling chill of the room, she wore the jacket. It wasn't much to look at. A heavy black Levi's denim jacket, faded to a dull charcoal at the shoulders and fraying at the cuffs. It was 3 sizes too big for her narrow frame. The collar was permanently creased, and the fabric smelled faintly of stale tobacco, motor oil, and Old Spice. A scent she hadn't bought in a decade, but somehow lingered in the heavy cotton weave. She kept the sleeves rolled up to her forearms. To the regulars, it was just Maggie's winter coat. To Maggie, it was a piece of armor. The diner was mostly empty, as it usually was at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. In the far corner booth sat Old Man Henderson, nursing a mug of black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He was meticulously reading a 3-day-old newspaper. 2 stools down from the register sat Pete, a long-haul trucker whose rig was parked outside, idling in the dirt lot. Pete was eating a slice of cherry pie with the slow, exhausted movements of a man who had been driving for 14 hours straight. It was quiet, the kind of heavy, isolated silence you only find in places the modern world has agreed to bypass. The only sounds were the hum of the ancient fluorescent lights overhead and the rhythmic swish-swish of Maggie's rag. Then the coffee in Pete's mug began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural vibration in the floorboards. Maggie felt it in the soles of her worn-out boots before she heard it. A deep, mechanical thrumming that seemed to vibrate up through the earth itself. Pete stopped chewing. He looked down at his coffee, watching the dark liquid ripple in concentric circles against the ceramic rim. Henderson slowly lowered his newspaper, his watery eyes shifting toward the front windows. The sound grew. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a swarm. A localized earthquake of V-twin engines running rich and loud. The low thrum escalated into a deafening roar that rattled the diner's front windows so violently Maggie thought the glass might finally give out. She stopped wiping the counter. She draped the rag over the edge of the sink, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked out the window. They were pulling into the dirt lot like an invading army. 50 motorcycles easy. Massive, stripped-down Harley-Davidsons, their chrome pipes gleaming dully under the overcast sky. They didn't just park. They claimed the space, angling their bikes to block the exits, boxing in Pete's 18-wheeler. The riders killed their engines almost in unison. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise had been. Through the dusty glass, Maggie watched them dismount. They were a sea of heavy black leather, denim, and heavy boots. And on the back of every single vest was the unmistakable red and white patch. The winged death head. Hell's Angels. Pete threw a $5 bill onto the counter, his hands visibly shaking. "Keep the change, Mags," he muttered, sliding off the stool. He didn't look back as he practically sprinted toward the kitchen swinging doors, opting for the back alley exit. He knew better than to walk out the front door right now. Henderson didn't move. He just raised his newspaper higher, trying to vanish behind the sports section. Maggie didn't flinch. She reached under the counter, feeling the cold, reassuring steel of the sawed-off shotgun she kept mounted near the register. She didn't grab it. Not yet. She just rested her fingertips against the barrel, took a slow, deep breath, and waited for the bell above the door to ring. The door didn't just open, it was kicked open. The cheap brass bell above it snapped off its mounting and clattered onto the floor tiles, letting out a sad, final chime. They spilled into the diner, bringing the cold air and the smell of exhaust and unwashed bodies with them. There were 20 of them in the first wave, with more piling up outside, smoking cigarettes and leaning against the stucco walls. The inside of the Copperhead suddenly felt entirely too small. They were loud, aggressively, purposefully loud. They laughed with their chests, shoved past each other, and kicked out chairs from the tables. They didn't ask for seating, they took it. Boots were thrown up onto tabletops. Leather jackets scraped against the vinyl booths. Leading the pack was a guy who looked like he had been born with a chip on his shoulder and spent his whole life trying to get someone to knock it off. He was young for a shot caller, maybe early 30s, with slicked-back dark hair, a thick neck covered in faded prison ink, and eyes that were completely flat and dead. He wore a pristine leather cut. On his lower back was the rocker identifying his state. On the front, a small rectangular patch read, "President." His name was Cole, and he was the head of a newly formed nomad charter. Young blood. The kind of guys who didn't respect the old ways, the old truces, or the quiet understandings that kept the underworld functioning. They were out to make a name for themselves, and they usually did it by breaking things. Cole walked straight to the center of the diner, stopping at the largest circular booth. He didn't sit immediately. He slowly scanned the room, his jaw working a piece of gum. He saw Henderson shaking behind his newspaper. He smirked. He looked at the empty pie plate where Pete had been sitting. Finally, his eyes locked onto Maggie. She was standing exactly where she had been. Her hands were now resting flat on the counter. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't cowering either. She was just looking at him, her face a mask of total indifference. Cole didn't like that. Fear was the currency he traded in, and the woman in the oversized denim jacket wasn't paying out. He slid into the center booth, kicking his heavy engineer boots up onto the table right next to the napkin dispenser. He leaned back, spreading his arms wide along the top of the booth. "Hey, sweetheart," Cole barked, his voice cutting through the noise of his laughing brothers. The diner quieted down slightly. His men knew the tone. The entertainment was starting. "You deaf or just stupid? We got a whole lot of empty cups here." Maggie picked up a glass pot of drip coffee from the warmer. She grabbed a stack of heavy white ceramic mugs. She walked out from behind the counter, her worn boots making soft, scuffing sounds against the linoleum. She didn't hurry. She walked up to the nearest table of bikers, set down 4 mugs, and poured the coffee. Black. No sugar offered. She moved to the next table. Cole watched her, his eyes narrowing. The men at the tables tried to mess with her. One of them, a heavy-set guy with a braided beard, stuck his leg out into the aisle to trip her. Maggie didn't break her stride. She simply stepped heavily onto his shin with the heel of her boot, using him as a step to reach the far side of the table, poured the coffee, and stepped off. The bearded biker hissed in pain, grabbing his leg. "Crazy bitch!" He snarled, half rising from his seat. "Sit down, Tiny." Cole commanded softly. Tiny sank back into the booth, glaring at Maggie. Maggie finished pouring the outer tables and finally walked up to Cole's booth. She set a mug down near his boots. She poured the steaming black liquid, not spilling a drop, then looked him in the eye. "Coffee's $2 a cup. Refills are free. Kitchen is closed until noon," Maggie said, her voice flat, raspy, and entirely devoid of emotion. Cole stared at her. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Kitchen's closed?" He looked around at his men, projecting his voice. "You hear that, boys? The kitchen's closed?" A chorus of mocking groans and laughter echoed through the diner. Cole turned his attention back to Maggie. He took his boots off the table, leaning forward, invading her space. "Look around, diner girl. Do we look like guys who care about your schedule? I got 50 hungry brothers outside. You're gonna turn that grill on. You're gonna cook every piece of bacon, egg, and steak you have in that freezer. And you're gonna do it right now." Maggie held the coffee pot. "Grill's broken. Needs a new pilot assembly. Won't be fixed till Thursday. I have coffee, and I have half a cherry pie. That's what you get." Cole's smirk vanished. The flat, dead look in his eyes hardened into something sharp and violent. He wasn't used to being told no, not by anyone, and certainly not by a tired waitress in a ghost town. "I don't think you understand who is sitting in your diner," Cole said, his voice dropping an octave. The surrounding bikers went completely silent. The tension in the room spiked, thick and suffocating. "I know exactly who's sitting in my diner," Maggie replied, not breaking eye contact. "A bunch of guys who are going to owe me $40 for coffee." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Henderson in his corner booth let out a soft, terrified whimper. Cole stood up. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, and moved with the quick, jerky aggression of a man looking for an excuse to strike. He stepped out of the booth, closing the distance between him and Maggie until they were inches apart. He loomed over her. Maggie didn't step back. She held her ground, the glass coffee pot still in her hand. If he swung, she was going to break the boiling pot across his jaw. She had done it before. She would do it again. "You got a smart mouth for someone entirely alone," Cole whispered, leaning down so his face was level with hers. He smelled of cheap whiskey and old sweat. "I could burn this wooden shack to the ground with you inside it, and the cops in this county wouldn't even bother to sift through the ashes." "You could try," Maggie said evenly. Cole's eyes twitched. The utter lack of fear was infuriating him. He needed to break her. He needed to humiliate her in front of his men to assert his dominance. He reached out, his heavy, calloused hand shooting forward. He didn't punch her. Instead, he grabbed the front of her oversized denim jacket, right at the lapel, intending to yank her forward off her feet and slam her against the nearest table. His fist bunched the heavy black denim. He pulled. As he did, the oversized collar of the jacket, which had been folded over itself, snapped open. The left side of the jacket, previously obscured by the fold and Maggie's posture, was suddenly fully exposed under the harsh fluorescent light. Cole yanked her forward about an inch and then froze, his fist still tightly gripping the fabric, locked in place. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he was going to pass out. His jaw went slack. The aggressive, predatory energy radiating from him vanished, replaced instantly by a cold, paralyzing shock. Stitched directly over Maggie's heart, sewn into the very fabric of the old Levi's jacket, was a patch. It wasn't a standard Hell's Angels patch. It wasn't a support shirt logo. It was small, maybe 4 inches across. It was a skull, hand-embroidered in faded white thread, missing its lower jaw. But it was what surrounded the skull that stopped Cole's heart. The skull was wrapped in a chain of pure gold thread. Not yellow fabric, actual metallic gold thread that gleamed in the dim light. Above the skull, stitched in a brutal, archaic Gothic font, were the letters AFFA. Below it, a single word, Atonement. And beneath that, a date, 1973. Cole couldn't breathe. Every muscle in his body locked up. Every patched member of the club knew the history. It wasn't written down in any charter rulebook. It was spoken in hushed tones around burn barrels and clubhouses deep into the night. It was the myth of the Atonement Patch. According to the law, there were only 3 of these patches in existence worldwide. They were given out by the original founding fathers of the club back in the late 60s and early 70s. They weren't given to members. They were given to civilians. They were given to individuals who had saved the life of a national president at the cost of their own blood. The rule surrounding the patch was absolute. It was the only rule that superseded every other law the club had. The wearer of the Atonement Patch is untouchable. Their property is untouchable. Their blood is our blood. Anyone who lays a hand on the wearer in anger forfeits their life. Not just their patch. Their life. And the lives of anyone who stood with them. Cole's mind raced, hitting a wall of sheer panic. He was looking at a ghost. He was looking at an execution order. He had just violently grabbed the jacket of a woman carrying the club's highest holy relic. His hand began to tremble. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, as if the denim were made of live wires, Cole uncurled his fingers. He released the fabric. Maggie calmly reached up and brushed the lapel of her jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles his fist had made. She didn't look at the patch. She just looked at Cole. "Like I said," Maggie murmured, her voice unchanged. "Coffee is $2. The men in the diner, unaware of what Cole had just seen, started getting restless. "Hey, boss!" Tiny called out from his booth. "You gonna snap her neck or what? I'm starving." Cole didn't turn around. He couldn't take his eyes off the gold thread. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead and rolled down his temple. "Shut up, Tiny," Cole said. His voice wasn't a bark anymore. It was hollow, weak. He took a slow step backward, putting distance between himself and Maggie. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. My apologies, Ma'am," Cole stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The entire diner went dead silent. The bikers exchanged confused, alarmed looks. Cole, the ruthless nomad president who had beaten a man half to death in Barstow 3 days ago over a spilled beer, was apologizing to a middle-aged waitress. Cole reached into his leather cut with a trembling hand. He pulled out a thick roll of bills. He didn't peel off a 20. He placed the entire roll, at least $2,000, gently on the counter next to the coffee pot. "For the coffee," Cole said softly. And for the disrespect." Maggie looked at the roll of cash. Then she looked back at Cole. "Your boys are making a mess." "We're leaving," Cole said instantly. He turned to his men. The flat, dead look was back, but now it was driven by pure terror. "Up, now! We're riding out!" "But boss, we just got—" Tiny started to protest. "I said we are leaving!" Cole roared, the panic finally bleeding into his voice. "Anyone leaves a piece of trash on the table, I'll cut their fingers off. Move!" They moved like roaches fleeing a sudden spotlight. There was no swagger left in the Nomad Charter. The heavy, intimidating choreography that had marked their arrival dissolved into a chaotic scramble. Chairs scraped violently across the cracked linoleum. Boots slipped on the dust they had just tracked in. Men who, 30 seconds ago, were ready to tear the diner apart with their bare hands were now tripping over each other to reach the door. Tiny hesitated. He was slow in the head, and big everywhere else, his brain failing to process the sudden shift in gravity. He stood by the booth, looking from Cole's retreating back to Maggie, his thick brow furrowed. "Boss?" Tiny grunted, his hand resting on the heavy brass chain clipped to his belt. "We ain't just gonna let a waitress—" Cole spun around. He grabbed the front of Tiny's leather cut with both hands, using the larger man's momentum to yank him violently towards the door. Cole's face was inches from Tiny's, his features twisted into a pale, sweat-slicked mask of sheer panic. "I will put a bullet in your kneecap and leave you in the dirt if you don't walk out that door right now," Cole hissed, the words spraying spit onto Tiny's cheek. "Don't look at her. Don't look at the counter. Walk," Tiny swallowed, the threat finally piercing his thick skull. He nodded numbly and shoved his way out into the biting desert wind. Cole was the last one out. He paused in the doorway, the broken bell hanging sadly above his head. He didn't look at Maggie. He looked at the floorboards, his chest heaving under his heavy jacket. He gave a sharp, jerking nod to the empty space in front of him, a final terrified gesture of submission, and stepped out into the cold. The door clicked shut. Outside, the startup was a mess. There was no coordinated rumble, no organized formation. Bikes coughed and roared to life in a frantic, overlapping cacophony. Riders dumped their clutches, kicking up massive rooster tails of sand and gravel as they fought to get their heavy machines turned around in the tight lot. Tires squealed against the asphalt as they hit Route 375, accelerating recklessly back the way they came. The noise swelled into a deafening roar, peaked, and then began to stretch out, thinning as they fled toward the horizon. Inside the Copperhead diner, the silence poured back in. It felt heavier this time. Thicker. Maggie stood perfectly still behind the counter. She didn't exhale a ragged breath of relief. She didn't collapse against the register. She watched the dust settle in the parking lot through the large plate glass window. In the far corner, Old Man Henderson slowly lowered his 3-day-old newspaper. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled like dry leaves. He stared at the empty booths, the overturned chairs, and finally at the thick stack of $100 bills sitting next to the drip coffee machine. "Maggie!" Henderson rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper on dry wood. What in God's name just happened?" Maggie picked up the roll of money. It was heavy. $2,000, maybe $3,000. Drug money, extortion money, blood money. She didn't care. It spent the same. She opened the register, the old bell letting out a sharp ding, and dropped the roll entirely into the cash drawer. She slammed the drawer shut. They remembered they had somewhere to be, Arthur. Maggie said flatly. She picked up her damp rag. She walked around the counter, her worn boots scuffing the floor, and began to right the overturned chairs. One by one, she wiped down a table where a boot print had left a smear of grease. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. But beneath the heavy, oversized denim of the jacket, a deep, persistent ache began to throb in her left shoulder. It was a phantom pain, a ghost waking up after years of dormancy. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of what had just been exposed. She hadn't shown the patch in 15 years. She had folded the collar just right, pinned it from the inside, burying the gold thread beneath layers of faded black denim. She wore the jacket every day to hide it, keeping it close, keeping it buried. Now the seal was broken. Cole had seen it. Cole knew. And bikers talk. Maggie walked back behind the counter and picked up the glass coffee pot. The liquid inside was still hot. She poured herself a half mug, black. She leaned against the back counter, wrapped both hands around the ceramic to leach the warmth from it, and stared out at the empty highway. The wind howled, throwing another handful of sand against the glass. Sheriff Bill Brody was 5 miles out from the Copperhead when the swarm blew past him. He had been cruising at a steady 55, a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee in the cup holder of his Ford Explorer, listening to the static hum of the county dispatch. When he saw the headlights crest the ridge in the oncoming lane, he instinctively eased off the accelerator. 50 bikes, moving at least 90 miles an hour in a 65 zone. They blew past his cruiser like a localized hurricane, the backdraft physically shaking his heavy SUV. Brody caught glimpses of black leather, chrome, and the red and white deathhead rockers flashing by. He didn't hit his lights. He didn't hit his sirens. He wasn't a fool. You don't pull over a nomad charter of Hell's Angels for speeding when you're a 60-year-old county sheriff an hour away from your nearest backup. You write down the direction they're heading, and you call it in. But as he watched the tail lights shrink in his rearview mirror, a cold knot formed in his stomach. They were heading east. The only thing east of here for 30 miles was Alkali Flats and the Copperhead Diner. Brody hit the gas. The Explorer's engine whined as he pushed it up to 80. He knew Maggie. Everyone in the county knew Maggie. She was a fixture, as permanent and weathered as the rock formations out past the salt flats. She didn't talk much about where she came from, and out here, people respected that. The desert was a place for people who needed a lot of empty space around them. But Brody also knew that a pack of 50 agitated 1%ers pulling into a roadside diner usually ended in shattered glass, broken bones, or worse. 10 minutes later, the Copperhead came into view. Brody braced himself. He expected to see smoke. He expected to see the windows blown out, the neon sign smashed, blood on the dirt lot. Instead, he saw Pete's 18-wheeler idling quietly near the alley. The front of the diner was intact. The dirt lot was heavily tracked with fresh tire ruts, deeply gouged into the earth, but otherwise, it was eerily peaceful. Brody parked his cruiser near the front entrance. He unhooked the thumb brake on his holster, keeping his hand resting casually near the grip of his Glock 21, and stepped out into the wind. He walked up to the door and pushed it open. The broken bell above it made a dull, metallic scrape. The diner was spotless. The chairs were tucked in. The floor had been recently swept. The smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, masking the lingering scent of exhaust fumes. Old man Henderson was gone, likely having bolted the second his legs could carry him. Maggie was at the far end of the counter, refilling the napkin dispensers. She wore the same oversized black denim jacket she always wore. Brody stopped inside the doorway, his hand slowly falling away from his holster. He looked around the empty room, then looked at the tire tracks visible through the window. "Mags," Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Maggie didn't look up immediately. She finished shoving a stack of paper napkins into the chrome holder, snapped the spring-loaded plate shut, and then turned to him. "Coffee's fresh, Bill. You want a cup, or are you just here to let the draft in?" Brody walked slowly towards the counter. He took off his Stetson, setting it down on the formica surface. He leaned his elbows on the counter, studying her face. She looked tired. But then she always looked tired. There was no panic in her eyes, no residual trauma. "I just passed 50 patched members hauling ass toward the state line," Brody said. "They looked like they were running from a forest fire. Their tracks are all over your lot. They stopped in for a cup," Maggie said, pulling a clean mug from beneath the counter and filling it. She set it in front of him. Brody stared at the black liquid. 50 angels stopped in for coffee, and then they left in a panic. I told them the kitchen was closed. Brody let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Mags, don't play with me. I've been doing this job a long time. Those boys don't run from closed kitchens. They burn the kitchen down and cook their meat on the ashes. What happened in here?" Maggie picked up her rag and began wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean. "Guy got handsy. I corrected him. He paid his tab. They left. He paid his tab." Brody repeated the words slowly. He knew she was lying, or at least heavily editing the truth. He looked past her, toward the open cash register drawer slightly ajar, because of a jammed receipt roll. Brody's eyes locked onto the drawer. Sitting on top of the 1s and 5s was a wad of cash as thick as a brick, mostly hundreds. Brody pointed a thick, calloused finger at the register. "That's a hell of a tip for a cup of coffee." Maggie casually pushed the drawer completely shut with her hip. The metal clicked softly. They felt bad about the mess. Brody sighed. He picked up his coffee mug and took a long sip. It was scalding, bitter, and exactly what he needed. He looked at Maggie. He looked at the heavy, frayed denim jacket swallowing her frame. He noticed, for the first time in years, how she always kept her left arm slightly tucked, how the jacket was always pinned or folded over her left breast. He didn't push. The golden rule of the high desert: if someone is keeping a secret that isn't actively bleeding on your boots, you leave it buried. "You know they'll talk," Brody said quietly. He didn't know what it was, but he knew how the world worked. Whatever spooked them, they're going to tell someone, and someone worse might come looking to see if the ghost is real. Maggie stopped wiping the counter. She looked up at Brody, her dime-colored eyes hard and unreadable. "Let them look," she said. "The coffee's still $2. The neon open sign buzzed aggressively in the window, throwing harsh red light onto the darkened dirt lot. At 10 o'clock sharp, Maggie walked over and pulled the chain. The light clicked off, plunging the front of the diner into shadows. She locked the heavy deadbolt on the front glass door. She pulled the metal security grate across the inside, snapping the padlocks into place. She walked through the silent diner, her boots echoing off the linoleum, and locked the back kitchen door, shoving a heavy wooden 2x4 into the metal brackets bolted to the frame. She was entirely alone. The quiet of the night was different from the quiet of the day. The daytime silence was just a lack of people. The nighttime silence was an active, heavy thing that pressed against the walls of the building. Maggie walked into the cramped back office. It was no bigger than a closet, containing a battered metal desk, a safe from the 1950s, and a single exposed light bulb dangling from the ceiling. She sat down in the squeaky office chair. She stared at the cinder-block wall for a long time, the events of the morning finally settling into her bones like lead. Slowly, her hands moved to the collar of the oversized denim jacket. Her fingers felt stiff, arthritic. She unbuttoned the heavy brass clasps down the front. She shrugged her right shoulder, pulling her arm free from the sleeve. Then she reached across her body and carefully, gingerly, pulled the jacket off her left shoulder. She draped it over the back of the metal chair. Beneath the jacket she wore a simple, faded grey, long-sleeve thermal shirt. She reached up and gripped the hem of the shirt, pulling it over her head. The exposed light bulb cast harsh, unforgiving shadows across her torso. Her right side was normal, weathered, thin, but unblemished. Her left side was a topographical map of violence. Starting from her collarbone and jaggedly carving its way down across her left breast and rib cage was a massive starburst of scar tissue. It was thick, ropey, and discolored, the kind of scar that comes from profound trauma and rough emergency surgery in a place that wasn't a hospital. The flesh was permanently puckered, a brutal crater where muscle and tissue had been torn away and barely put back together. It was an old wound, decades old, but the phantom pain radiating from it tonight was sharp and fresh. Maggie touched the edge of the scar tissue with her fingertips. The texture was smooth, like melted wax. She closed her eyes. She didn't want to go back there, but the dam had cracked. The gold thread on the jacket had acted as a key, turning the lock she had built in her mind. The smell hit her first. The coppery, suffocating stench of massive blood loss mixing with the sharp, chemical tang of leaking gasoline. 1973. It wasn't a movie. There was no slow motion, no dramatic music. It was just chaos, heat, and dirt. A stretch of unnamed dirt road outside of Bakersfield. The sun beating down like a hammer. She was 22. Her hands were covered in grease and dirt. She was pressing down with all her meager weight onto the chest of a man 3 times her size. The man was wearing a leather cut. The winged death head on the back was soaked dark red. He was drowning in his own blood, his breathing a wet, ragged gurgle. He had taken 2 rounds from a sawed-off shotgun at point-blank range. He was the national president, the man who held the entire underworld structure together, and he was dying in the dirt. Other members were dead in the scrub brush. Rivals. The ambush had been swift and merciless. Maggie wasn't a biker. She was just a mechanic's daughter who had been driving her beat-up Ford pickup down the wrong road at the wrong time. When the shooting stopped, the perpetrators fled, leaving the wreckage behind. She could have kept driving. She should have kept driving. Instead, she stopped. She remembered the man's massive, heavy hand gripping her forearm as she shoved a greasy rag into the gaping hole in his chest. His grip was crushing, desperate. Don't let me die in the dirt, kid!" He had wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. She didn't. She dragged him, all 250 pounds of dead weight, into the bed of her truck. That was when the remaining rival shooters had circled back to finish the job. She remembered the deafening roar of the shotgun blast hitting the side of her truck. She remembered the blinding pain as the buckshot tore through the door panel and into her shoulder, ripping her left side open. She remembered the sheer, animalistic terror. But she didn't stop driving. She drove 30 miles with one hand on the wheel, her left arm hanging useless and bleeding out, the back of her truck painted in the president's blood. She drove him straight through the front doors of the compound, crashing her truck into the main gate. She had passed out before they even pulled him from the bed. She woke up 3 weeks later in a heavily guarded private clinic. The president had lived. When she finally left the clinic, a man she had never seen before handed her a folded denim jacket. He didn't speak. He just bowed his head, turned, and walked away. Maggie opened her eyes, pulling herself out of the memory. The harsh light of the diner office snapped back into focus. She looked at the jacket hanging over the back of the chair. The gold thread of the patch caught the weak light, gleaming fiercely in the gloom. A FFA atonement, 1973. It wasn't a gift. It was a brand, a permanent tether to a world she had spent the last 40 years trying to escape. The desert had hidden her well. But the desert was changing, and the ghosts were getting restless. Maggie picked up her grey thermal shirt and pulled it back on, covering the brutal topography of her scars. She picked up the heavy denim jacket and slid her arms into the sleeves, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of it settle onto her shoulders. She turned off the single light bulb, plunging the office into darkness, and walked out into the diner to wait for morning. The Stardust Motel in Tonopah was the kind of place where people went when they ran out of options, money, or luck. It sat 100 miles north of the Copperhead Diner, a decaying cinder-block L shape surrounding an empty, cracked swimming pool filled with tumbleweeds and dry rot. Cole's Nomad charter had taken over the entire second floor. They hadn't stopped riding until the gas gauges on their heavy baggers dipped dangerously close to empty. Usually, a hostile takeover of a roadside motel by 50 patched members involved broken bottles, terrified management, and a roaring party that lasted until dawn. Tonight, there was none of that. The bikes were parked in tight, defensive formations. The men were quiet. They sat on the concrete walkway outside their rooms, chain-smoking and passing bottles of cheap whiskey in grim silence. The younger members didn't know exactly what had happened in the diner, but they knew what fear smelled like. They had seen their president, a man who built his reputation on unhinged brutality, retreat from a middle-aged waitress like he had looked the devil in the eye. Inside room 212, Cole was pacing. The room smelled of stale beer and mildew. The yellow patterned wallpaper was peeling at the corners. Cole's heavy leather cut lay draped over the edge of the sagging mattress, the president patch mocking him in the dim light of the bedside lamp. He hadn't stopped shaking. It was a subtle involuntary tremor in his hands, a physical manifestation of a mind frantically trying to calculate a way out of an inescapable box. "Boss," Tiny said softly from the corner of the room. He was sitting on a hard plastic chair, his massive hands resting on his knees. "You gotta talk to us. The boys are spooked. You gotta tell us what you saw under that jacket." Cole stopped pacing. He looked at Tiny, his eyes bloodshot and wide. "You wouldn't understand. None of you would. You're too new. You don't know the old laws." "Then teach us," Tiny urged, his thick brow furrowing. Cole let out a ragged, bitter laugh. "There ain't no teaching this, Tiny. You either know it or you're dead. And right now, I'm pretty sure I'm dead." Cole turned his back on the giant and stared at the rotary telephone bolted to the wall next to the bathroom door. It was a filthy beige thing, the plastic yellowed by decades of cigarette smoke. He had been staring at it for 2 hours. He didn't want to make the call. Making the call meant making it real. It meant putting it on the record. But if he didn't make the call, and word filtered up the chain through the whispers of the road, the punishment for hiding it would be infinitely worse. Cole walked over to the phone. He picked up the heavy receiver. The dial tone buzzed in his ear like an angry wasp. He dialed a 702 area code, followed by a sequence of numbers he had memorized, but prayed he would never have to use. It rang twice. "Speak." The voice on the other end was like gravel being crushed in a vice. It belonged to a man named Arthur Dutch Miller. Dutch was the regional president, an old guard heavyweight who had been wearing the patch since the late 60s. He commanded the territory from Las Vegas to Reno, and he ran it with the ruthless, quiet efficiency of a cartel boss. "Dutch, it's Cole." A pause. Then, the rhythmic wheeze of an old man taking a drag from a cigarette. "You're a long way from Barstow, Cole. I hear your boys made a mess in my state." "We're in Tonopah, the Stardust." Cole swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "Dutch, I need counsel. I stepped in something." "You're a nomad," Dutch rumbled indifferently. "Stepping in shit is what you do. Pay the local cops, bury the body, and move on." "It's not cops," Cole said, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. I was at a diner. The Copperhead. Middle of nowhere." The silence on the line grew heavy. "I know the Copperhead," Dutch said, his tone shifting. The indifference was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. "What did you do, Cole?" "I didn't know. I swear to God, Dutch, she didn't have it showing. She kept it folded under her collar. I just grabbed her jacket to make a point, and the collar popped. I saw it." "Saw what?" Cole closed his eyes. The words felt like broken glass in his throat. A patch, hand-sewn, faded white skull, gold thread, the letters AFFA, and below it, it said Atonement, 1973. The line went dead quiet. Cole could hear the faint, static crackle of the long-distance connection. He could hear Tiny breathing in the corner of the room. He couldn't hear Dutch. "Dutch?" Cole asked weakly. When Dutch finally spoke, the gravelly rasp was gone. His voice was hollow, echoing with the weight of 50 years of history. "You put your hands on the girl in the denim jacket." "I didn't hurt her. I just grabbed the lapel. Soon as I saw the gold, I backed off. I left $2,000 on the counter. We rode out. I swear, Dutch, I didn't touch her skin." "It doesn't matter," Dutch said quietly. It wasn't a threat. It was the stating of a physical law, like gravity. The gold thread is absolute. She wears the blood of the club. She is untouchable. Her airspace is untouchable. Dutch, come on. I'm a president. I command 50 men. We're young, we bring in money. You can't let an old wives' tale. Shut your mouth! Dutch snapped. The sheer authority in the two words made Cole flinch physically. It is not a tale. In 73, the national president was ambushed by the outlaws. 2 shotgun blasts to the chest. He was dying in the dirt. That woman, that girl, dragged him into her truck. She took buckshot to the shoulder, nearly lost her arm, and drove him through the gates of the Bakersfield compound while she was bleeding out. She saved the absolute core of this club. Cole leaned against the peeling wallpaper, his legs suddenly weak. There are only 3 atonement patches in the world. Dutch continued, his voice cold and flat. And you just assaulted the wearer of one of them. What do I do? Cole whispered, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. Where is your cut? On the bed. Leave it there. Dutch ordered. Tell your men to surrender their weapons to the sergeant-at-arms. All of them. Lock yourselves in your rooms. Do not start your bikes. Do not walk to the diner across the street. You sit in that room and you wait for me. Dutch, please. The dial tone buzzed in Cole's ear. Dutch had hung up. Cole slowly lowered the receiver. He turned to face Tiny. The giant biker looked confused, waiting for orders. Boss? Tiny asked. What's the play? Cole looked at the leather cut on the bed. He looked at the patches he had bled for, fought for, and defined his entire existence by. There is no play, Cole said hollowly. We are dead. Thursday passed in a slow, agonizing crawl of wind and blowing sand. Maggie went about her routine at the Copperhead Diner with the mechanical precision of a clock. She scrubbed the flat-top grill until the steel shone dull silver. She restocked the napkin dispensers. She brewed fresh pots of coffee every 3 hours, even though no one came in to drink them. The desert had a way of warning you when a storm was coming. The animals went to ground. The air felt thin and charged. The regulars, the truckers, the stray tourists, the local ranchers seemed to instinctively avoid Route 375 that day. Sheriff Bill Brody was the only one who broke the quarantine. He pulled his Ford Explorer into the lot just after noon, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet expanse. He walked in, took his usual stool, and watched Maggie pour his coffee. State police got a tip, Brody said, not looking at her, keeping his eyes on the black liquid in his mug. A nomad charter of Hell's Angels is locked down at the Stardust in Tonopah. 50 guys. They ain't drinking. They ain't fighting. Hotel manager says they look like they're waiting for the firing squad. Maggie wiped down the register. Tonopah's outside your jurisdiction, Bill. It is, Brody agreed. He took a sip of his coffee. But whatever put the fear of God into 50 outlaws happened right here in my county, in this room. Maggie didn't reply. She kept wiping. Brody sighed, setting the mug down. Mags, I don't know what kind of history you dragged out here with you. I don't want to know. But men like that don't just get spooked and walk away. They're waiting for someone. And whoever that someone is, they're probably going to come here to verify the story. Let them come. Brody turned on his stool, looking at her squarely. I can park a cruiser out front, leave my lights on, give whoever is coming a reason to keep driving. Maggie stopped wiping. She looked at the old sheriff. She appreciated him. He was a good man in a hard place. But a badge meant nothing to the storm that was gathering. You put a uniform out front, Bill. You're just putting a target in the crosshairs. Maggie said, her voice soft but unyielding. This isn't a matter of law. It's club business. You get between them and their business, they won't hesitate to put you in the ground. Go back to town. Drink your coffee, file your paperwork, and stay off 375 tomorrow. Brody stared at her for a long time. He read the absolute certainty in her dime-colored eyes. He nodded slowly, tossed a $5 bill on the counter, and walked out. He didn't come back. Friday morning arrived wrapped in a dense, freezing fog that rolled off the distant mountains, reducing visibility on the highway to 50 yards. At exactly 7 a.m., the silence broke. It wasn't a roar. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping that seemed to synchronize with the beating of Maggie's heart. The sound of perfectly tuned, heavy displacement engines running at low RPMs. Maggie stood behind the counter. She pulled the oversized denim jacket tighter around her narrow shoulders, feeling the thick, puckered scars on her left breast ache in the cold morning air. Through the fog, headlights appeared. They didn't swarm the lot like Cole's nomads. They rolled in with the discipline of a military motorcade. 12 motorcycles. No more, no less. They were older bikes, Evo motors, shovelheads, and at the front, a pristine, immaculately restored 1948 panhead. Behind the bikes, a black, unmarked cargo van pulled into the dirt lot, its tires crunching heavily. The riders killed their engines simultaneously. The precision of it was terrifying. These were not young men looking for a thrill. These were the old guard, the enforcers, men with thick grey beards, weathered faces, and eyes that had seen and committed acts of unspeakable violence over the last 40 years. The rider on the panhead dismounted slowly. He was a tall man, entirely silver-haired, wearing a heavy black leather coat over his cut. An oxygen tube was looped over his ears, connected to a small green tank slung across his back. He leaned heavily on a polished wooden cane. Dutch Miller. Dutch didn't look at the diner. He looked at the black van. He gave a single, short nod. The back doors of the van swung open. 2 massive enforcers, wearing black leather gloves, reached inside and dragged a man out into the dirt. It was Cole. He was unrecognizable from the arrogant shot caller who had kicked open the diner door 3 days prior. He was stripped to a filthy white t-shirt and jeans. His face was a swollen purple mask of deep bruises and dried blood. His hands were bound in front of him with heavy plastic zip ties. He could barely stand, his legs buckling as the enforcers hauled him upright. Dutch turned and began walking towards the copperhead, his cane clicking against the frozen dirt. The 2 enforcers followed, dragging Cole by the armpits. The remaining 9 bikers stayed by their machines, standing in absolute, silent vigil. Maggie didn't reach for the shotgun beneath the counter. She simply stood her ground, her hands resting flat on the formica, waiting. The diner door opened. It didn't slam. It was pushed open gently, respectfully. Dutch walked in first. The rhythmic hiss of his oxygen tank and the heavy clack of his cane were the only sounds in the room. The 2 enforcers followed, tossing Cole roughly onto the linoleum floor at the center of the room. Cole groaned, curling onto his side, not daring to look up. Dutch stopped 10 feet from the counter. He took a long, slow look around the diner. He noted the cleanliness. He noted the cracked vinyl booths. Finally, his milky, sharp eyes settled on Maggie. He looked at her face. Then his gaze tracked down to the oversized black Levi's jacket. He stared at the folded left lapel for a long time. Slowly, painfully, Dutch reached up with a gloved hand and pulled the oxygen tube from his nose. He wanted no barriers for this. He reached up and removed his dark sunglasses, folding them and sliding them into his pocket. Then Arthur Dutch Miller, a man who ordered hits, controlled multi-million-dollar trafficking routes, and bent entire state prison populations to his will, bowed his head to the waitress. It wasn't a nod. It was a deep, sustained bow of absolute reverence. The 2 enforcers behind him immediately snapped to attention, their hands clasped behind their backs, mirroring the gesture. "Ma'am?" Dutch said, his voice a gravelly rumble that filled the quiet room. "My name is Arthur Miller. I hold the gavel for this region. I was a prospect at the Bakersfield compound in the summer of 1973. I was the one who hosed the blood out of the bed of your fort." Maggie's expression didn't change. Her dime-colored eyes remained flat and guarded. "I remember the truck," she said softly. Shame about the interior. A faint ghost of a smile touched Dutch's lips, then vanished. He leaned heavily on his cane, catching his breath without the oxygen. "You gave us our future that day. You bled for the skull. The man you pulled from the dirt kept this brotherhood from fracturing into 100 warring pieces. There is not a patched member alive today who does not owe his seat at the table to you." He gestured with his cane toward the bleeding man on the floor. "This is Cole. He was granted a charter. He abused the privilege. 3 days ago, he laid his hands on the atonement. By the absolute law of the Founding Fathers, his life, his property, and his charter are forfeit." Cole let out a ragged, muffled sob against the linoleum. He didn't beg. He knew better. Dutch reached into the heavy pocket of his leather coat. He pulled out a large, folding buck knife. The handle was carved bone and brass. He walked slowly to the counter and placed the knife gently onto the formica surface, right in front of Maggie. "The club's ledger is unbalanced," Dutch said, looking her directly in the eye. "The law says his blood belongs to the wearer of the patch. You hold the knife. You tell us where to cut. We will do it here, or we will take him out into the alkali flats and you will never have to look at him again. But the choice is yours. Balance the ledger." The silence in the diner stretched tight. The hum of the ancient fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed deafening. Maggie looked down at the knife. It was a beautiful, terrible tool, heavy, purposeful. She looked at Cole, curled on the floor, weeping in the dust of her diner. He was pathetic. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was just a broken piece of meat. She felt the dull, familiar throb of the massive scar tissue under her jacket. She remembered the heat of 73, the metallic smell of blood, the sheer, blinding terror of the buckshot tearing through her flesh. She had saved a life that day, but she had also been dragged into a world of endless, cyclical violence. She had hidden in the desert for 40 years to escape it. She was not going to let them bring it back into her sanctuary. Maggie didn't touch the knife. She reached under the counter, pulled out a damp rag, and casually wiped a faint coffee ring off the formica, a few inches from the blade. "I don't want your blood on my linoleum," Maggie said, her voice raspy, cynical, and entirely grounded. "I just mopped." Dutch watched her, his expression unreadable. "The offense cannot go unpunished, Mom. If we walk away, the patch loses its meaning. The law breaks." "I didn't say walk away," Maggie replied, tossing the rag into the sink. She looked down at Cole. "You take him out of here. You strip his ink. You take his bikes. You send him out into the world with nothing but the skin on his back. If he ever steps foot in Nevada again, you bury him. But you don't do it in my diner, and you don't do it in my name." Dutch stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He understood perfectly. She was enforcing the law, but refusing to participate in the butcher's work. It was a mercy the boy on the floor didn't deserve, but it was a command the club had to obey. "As you say," Dutch murmured. He picked up the buck knife, folded it with a sharp snap, and returned it to his pocket. He turned to the two enforcers. "Get this piece of shit out of her sight," Dutch ordered. "Take him to the flats. Get the blowtorch ready for his back piece." The enforcers grabbed Cole by the arms, lifting him bodily from the floor. They dragged him out the door, his boots scraping uselessly against the tiles. Cole didn't scream. He just hung his head, disappearing into the cold fog outside. Dutch turned back to Maggie. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a thick money clip. He peeled off a crisp, unwrinkled $100 bill and laid it flat on the counter. "For the coffee," Dutch said. "Coffee's $2. Maggie replied automatically. "Keep the change." Dutch hooked his oxygen tube back over his ears, taking a deep, rattling breath of the sterile air. He adjusted his leather coat, hiding the winged death head on his back. He tipped his head to her one last time. "Safe roads, ma'am. You'll never see us again." Dutch turned and walked out, his cane clicking against the floorboards. The door closed quietly behind him. Maggie watched through the plate glass window. The black van backed out of the lot, disappearing into the fog. The 12 motorcycles started up, a low, synchronized rumble, and followed the van eastward, melting into the grey morning. In less than a minute, they were gone. The only proof they had ever been there were the fresh tire tracks in the dirt and the $100 bill sitting on the counter. The Copperhead Diner was silent once more. The heavy, peaceful isolation of the high desert rushed back in to fill the void. Maggie reached out and picked up the $100 bill. She opened the register, dropped the cash into the drawer, and closed it with a soft click. She reached up to the collar of her oversized, ratty denim jacket. She adjusted the heavy black fabric, making sure the fold was perfect, ensuring the gold thread was completely buried in the dark. The phantom ache in her shoulder was already beginning to fade. She turned away from the window, picked up a fresh pot from the brewer, and went back to wiping the counter. Sometimes, real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't rely on 50 heavy bikes or a desperate show of force. True respect is earned in the brutal, quiet sacrifices that history never forgets. And sometimes, a single thread of gold is enough to hold back an army of nightmares. If you felt the chill of that diner and respect the unwritten codes of survival, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who knows that still waters run deep. And subscribe to the channel for more grounded stories of grit. Drop a comment below and let us know how you would have handled Cole in Maggie's boots.